Microsoft reported earnings, and it's a pretty mixed bag. As they are required to legally do every single quarter, Microsoft has reported its earnings. And this time around, it's a pretty mixed bag, at least for Xbox, because as we all know, Microsoft has been hyping up Q4. We had Call of Duty, we had Indiana Jones. There was a lot going on, and I'm sure there are other titles that dropped in that probably fancied your interest as well when it comes to Game Pass. But Microsoft has a couple different bets on the table, some longer horizon like Game Pass where they're trying to churn these things. They obviously bought Activision for $80 billion. And so there's just a lot to digest other than just the numbers. And now I'm not saying the numbers are fantastic. They're also not, they can be very much interpreted as negative. So it really comes down to some nuanced conversation here because Xbox is in a effectively a transition period, right? From a traditional console manufacturer to this service provider. And so let's dive into the details because I think it's important that we get them correct. So leading up to this earnings release, there was this little bit of information. Xbox's multi-platform releases made the company the top publisher in the world, which you would think instantly, right? Like, hey, Xbox had to have hit it out of the park. If Microsoft is the largest publisher in the world, how could it they have done great? Well, in theory, they did make more revenue than they traditionally had before they bought Activision. But you got to remember, like, much of their revenue comes from the Call of Duty that they release, Call of Duty Black Ops, Warzone, and everything else that comes with it. And so, before diving into the true financials here, it's worth pointing out that Microsoft is actually in a very healthy position as a company. They are going to be able to continue to survive for another quarter. They had revenue of 69.6, I almost said 69 point nice, $69.6 billion in revenue, and they put $24.1 billion dues into the bank. So that's $24 billion they can now go spend on probably more GPUs for all of their AI initiatives. So let's look at their actual earnings here because there's a lot to dive into. So gaming revenue, so that is overall gaming revenue. So every bit of revenue all rolled up into one little line item declined 7%. So what does, initially you're thinking, and I'm the same way. It's like, ooh, they had revenue decline of 7% and we were expecting Game Pass growth like that. Ooh, and they released Call of Duty during this quarter. That's tough. But then you got to remember comparing it to what they did last year where games were not in Game Pass. We'll get into that in a second here. Xbox content and services revenue grew 2%. Now, 2% is not something to really get excited about. It's not flat. So technically it's not flat. It's a little bit up. 1% we would say is a rounding error in flat. So, they grew at 2%. But the big one here is Xbox hardware dropped 29%. Which is significant, however, not unexpected though, right? Remember, we have to compare revenue, and let's talk about the hardware first, because last year, Microsoft or Xbox ran a lot of deals, remember? They were selling Xbox Series S's for $199. There were really no such deals. And obviously there was no Xbox Series X Pro this time around. And they did, do some hardware refreshing with like the drives and all that. But none of that is going to be enough to entice somebody who already owns a console to go rebuy another one. So when you start not giving people reasons to rebuy your own console, which again, I want to make the point, that is not what Microsoft wants to do. Microsoft wants to sell more subscriptions, not selling more plastic to the same people who already bought their plastic box. No offense to anybody who bought one. I've bought multiple Xboxes. I'm a plastic buyer. But what I mean here, like if you sell me 2 Xboxes, you're only selling one Game Pass subscription no matter how many Xboxes I buy this current generation. And so they're not in that market. So when you have, those are big ticket items, right? $199 or $499, right? These are big items. So in theory, when you stop selling as many consoles, your revenue is going to take a pretty big hit. However, they were only down 7%. So we don't quite have great insight into exactly how much, that offset was. But the hardware revenue drop isn't something, it's easy to point out saying, well, Xbox is dead. That's not how I interpret that. I think that's just natural for where we were at within this life cycle of the product. And candidly, Xbox not really trying because again, they didn't do any like hardcore deals this quarter compared to what they had done last year. So that's expected. Now, the content and service revenue growth, this is where I think it gets a little bit more interesting because here's the deal. Now, obviously, Microsoft has told us time and time again, judge us by our content service revenue growth, which is a loaded thing. That's Game Pass. So Game Pass and Xbox Live rolled into one, but we're just going to go with Game Pass. It's easier to enunciate on this video. It grew 2%. Remember, this was the first time that they launched Call of Duty in Game Pass. And hearing it only went up 2% seems a little befuddling, but when you start to think about it, it may not be as negative as you might think. Because remember, for people who already in Game Pass, they didn't buy, but they continued to pay for subscriptions. For people who weren't in Game Pass, rather than spending at minimum roughly $70, at least on the Xbox side, they could get the game for $20, at least for that month. So what we don't know here, because Microsoft, and I'll cut to the chase, they did not give us Game Pass numbers because we don't know the Game Pass growth, right? They traded $20 or $70 for $20, but ongoing. Obviously, they will make that money in the long run. But during this period, if they had a bunch of Game Pass signups, they obviously made $20 from that user instead of $70, which again would lower that revenue, but you could begin to see that it could inflate content and services revenue. Unfortunately, Microsoft's lack of transparency is once again hurting us, the fans and the analysts. So the analysts only care about the AI stuff. So that's how they get away with this, even though this is a multi-billion-dollar brand. We have to try to interpolate what the decline in revenue means because, again, Call of Duty sold less, right, if they only are selling $20 subscriptions versus the $70 bundles that they typically do. So, yeah, it's real easy to just point out and say, like, Xbox is doomed until you, like, put some content analysis behind it. You're like, okay, revenue was down 7%, which is probably the worst part, right, at the end of the day. But there's at least signs that like things like the bottom hasn't fallen out, right? You have signs like, hey, they're the largest publisher in the world. Hey, like, yeah, hardware's down, but that's to be expected. And actually content service revenue grew. And so when you start to look like at the C-suite, and this is all information that came from their slides, listening to the earnings call, which is what I did because I'm one of those people who listens to the earnings call, it paints a little bit different of a picture because there's some notable quotes from Amy Hood, who is the CFO, person in charge of finance over at Microsoft, and Satya Nadella, obviously the CEO. So let's start with Amy. She actually said there was stronger than expected results from Activision and Blizzard content, including Call of Duty. So we don't know what the Blizzard content was explicitly because they didn't call it out, but obviously on the Activision side, they're actually saying Call of Duty might have done a little bit better than anticipated, potentially. And then Satya Nadella went on the record and said there were 140 million hours streamed of Game Pass, which set quarterly revenue records. It also grew its PC subscriber base by over 30%. Now, the problem is, so the PC subscriber base grew by 30%. 30% of what? That number is completely useless. The last number we had was, 34 million. If you assume that the vast majority of them were PC gamers, which they're not, they're not. I forgot that I had a little thing there. You can hear me when whatever. Doesn't matter. We know they're not, but best case, let's say they were. That would be 9 million more, whatever, Game Pass subscribers. But it's some subset of that. PC Game Pass, in my opinion, has always been weaker to the console version, so it's some smaller subset. So 30% is a meaningless number, but hey, they did say it. He also said that Indiana Jones: The Great Circle has been played by more than 4 million players, which is good news, right? That's obviously a good title for them. It also is probably good news because it's coming to PlayStation here in the near future, which means it should hopefully sell well and really bolster Microsoft's numbers. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, we have no new Game Pass numbers, so a lot of this is just trying to weave together the narrative of like, is the strategy working? And that is a question that is kind of hard to answer without those numbers. And here's like the kind of the gut check, because this is more of a rosy picture. If the Game Pass subscriber numbers were good, they would have shared them, right? I don't even know what would be good, right? Microsoft, I think, said they wanted 100 million by 2030. And so you can do some interpolation and between now and then and try to, graph the points that have to happen. And it's probably not going to meet that expectation. That is probably the reality of it. If these numbers were really good or beat expectations, they would have given us something. But here we are with, I think it's now been a year, because I think we got the last numbers last January. And we still don't have any. We still don't have any update, which is unfortunate. So, Yeah. Now, it doesn't really end there because as it is an earnings call, now they're not I don't know if they're technically required to do this, but they always do. They do give forward-looking statements. Actually, Amy Hood did. So they actually expect revenue to grow in the low single digits, which would probably mean the expectation here is that Indiana Jones does pretty well cross-platform. I think that's probably a given. They also expect Xbox services revenue to grow in low single digits, which again is a good sign. I think everybody on the Microsoft side would love to see more aggressive growth, but at least it's growing. And of course, they expect hardware revenue to continue to decline, which basically means they're not launching any hardware. If they came out and said, hey, we expect it to increase, that means they had something up their sleeve, like a discount or new hardware handheld, which, we're all sort of sitting here on. So, which kind of brings this all home. Like, what happened? What is this a good quarter? Here's like my takeaway. Like, was it good or bad? To me, it feels like Xbox is kind of stuck. And I mean stuck in a layer of revenue that they just can't bust through because they have a lot of things that are either always working with them or against them. Here's what I mean, right? So they have Xbox Game Pass subscribers, which should be growing revenue, right? That's you're paying every month. It should be growing. However, they now have console sales declining 29%, which you have to sell the cheapest console. Let's just use easy math here. Easy math. $200. We know or we'll say $300 because I think that's more realistic for the Xbox Series S. For every one of those you didn't sell, you have to sign up 30 at minimum 30 or maximum 30 Game Pass subscribers at $10 a month. Now it is usually 20, so you're probably, if you do like a mixed bag, for every console you didn't sell this quarter compared to a year ago, you have to sign up 15 people. That could be challenging. Maybe it's a little less than that, but you guys see what I mean? Like, so they have this rut of okay, revenue from consoles is declining and they have Game Pass subscriptions growing at a slower rate. And so it's hard to overcome that gap in revenue just because it is like they're expensive things. Now, do not confuse revenue with net income, because Microsoft could go out and just say every console is $50 and they would make a ton of revenue overnight. They clear shelves of all their consoles, but then they would actually lose money, right? Because they're losing on it. So net income is truly, or margin as we would typically refer to it, the cost differential between the product and service and how much money you made, that percentage. Margin is typically what most people like myself pay attention to. So to me, it feels like Xbox is in this sort of stuck rut of revenue until they probably launch another console, and then they'll have a huge spike, which is right. Every launch cycle has a huge spike. But once they get that spike, it should hopefully be a little bit more sustainable and come from a higher plateau, right? They are slowly stepping up. And so here's the thing. Right now, Xbox and the gaming industry, just because of where we are in the console launch, is in a trough, right? It's how you get out of these troughs is by launching content services when you're in the bottom so that the bottoms become higher. This is going to make sense to like one person, at least makes sense in my brain, and hopefully it makes sense to you. So right, they're trying to raise the floor so that the next time, next console launch comes and then it starts to drop off, that floor is lower. So they're stepping up in revenue growth over time is the perpetual goal with what they're doing. And if you understood that or like that, you will just love what I talk about on this channel. So keep it subscribed, because these are like the things that I pay attention to, because this is kind of like what I do for my real job. YouTube is not a real job for anybody who's watching this. I do this as fun, as a hobby. And yeah, so there you go. They're working on that stair step, but for currently they're stuck in this revenue gap until they figure out how to have a little bit of a breakthrough, which explains the multi-platform thing at the end of the day. If everyone's saying, well, why are they going multi-platform? It's because they've come to the same realization that I have, or I came to the same realization that they are. They're stuck in this band. And so by going multi-platform, they now have ways to increase. And then by doing that and just saying, screw it, this is what we're doing. We don't care as much about selling consoles as we do just be improving that margin. It all makes sense. So yeah, there is the BD Sam's financial breakdown of the latest quarter. Hopefully you found that interesting. I mean, if you've made it all the way to 14 minutes or wherever we're at here on this video, I look at the little timer down on OBS when I hit the wrap up. Make sure to keep it subscribed here, because on the BS on this channel is me.